Hi, my name's Jonathan Clark. Welcome to part 3 of my little series here on how to do a live DJ performance using the Ableton Live software. Now, in the first two parts, if you haven't watched those before, you should probably go watch those right now because some of the stuff I'm going to talk about in this part and in the last part of the series builds on the stuff that I talked about in the first parts. So go back and check those out if you haven't already. But let's assume that you have and carry on. So basically this part of the series, I'm going to talk about the 4 optional pieces of equipment that can help you out. They're not absolutely mandatory, but they'll definitely help you out if you're trying to do live DJing performance. Okay, and I touched on these briefly in the first two parts. We have headphones, we have MIDI controllers, we have external sound card, and we have a DJ mixer. Now, strictly speaking, I believe I said earlier that each of these 4 pieces of equipment is basically independent of each other, and so you can use any one of the 4. You can get a couple of the 4 and work them together, or you can have all 4 of the items. And it doesn't really matter which ones you have and don't have. I mean, the more equipment, usually the better, although it also gets a little bit more expensive. But when I said earlier they're all completely independent, that's not strictly speaking. So let me just cover basically how some of these can relate to each other. And probably the best thing to do to explain this is also to talk about, I get a lot of people asking which of the 4 pieces of equipment should I buy first when I'm on a budget, okay? So I'll cover that as I talk about these pieces of equipment. Okay, so what I would recommend getting first obviously is the headphones, because the headphones you can use for a lot of other applications. They're probably one of the cheaper of the 4 pieces of equipment, and you can use them all the time. You can use them for listening to music outside of DJing. So, and just to give you a quick background of these 4 pieces of equipment, the relative costs, I'm talking in Canadian dollars right now. But these headphones, Pioneers, well, let's say I'm using the newer ones, the HDJ 2000s. We're talking about roughly 320 Canadian dollars for those right now. And right now the Canadian dollar is essentially at par with the US dollar, so you could say this is US dollars too. So about $320 plus tax for the headphones. I have a MIDI controller here. It's the Newmark Mix Track controller. And that runs $150 plus tax, so that's a fairly cheap unit. And it actually appears to be a fairly decent unit. I haven't used it a whole lot yet, but so far I'm happy with it. It also comes with the light version of Virtual DJ software, and that's not something that I am going to use, but you can use it without the Virtual DJ software. And we're going to do an example of that as we integrate it with Ableton today. The Focusrite, Scarlett Focusrite external sound card I have over there, the 18i-6, that is $300. There's another one called the 8i6, which is a less complex card, and it has fewer inputs, but I think it's actually more suited for a DJ application. So that one is only $250, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then finally, DJ mixers. You can have pretty much any DJ mixer. That's going to be your most expensive piece of equipment, and that is the one that I would recommend getting last because of partly because of the expense and partly because it's the least important for you to have in a home system, even if you are trying to be a DJ. Okay, so when I talked about how these things, some are independent and some are based, some work better with each other. Well, the headphones, those you can get right off the bat and not have any of the other pieces of equipment. That's fine. The MIDI controller. What's the point of the MIDI controller? Well, I said earlier that in one of the first 2 sections, I actually used a keyboard, an X-Station Novation keyboard, as an example of a MIDI controller. And in the last section of this video, I showed you how you can use the mouse to change a lot of controls on the effects and to navigate around the Ableton interface. So you could turn up and down the lows on the EQ3. You can change the mids. You can change the highs. You can hit the cutoff switch to turn them off or on. You can go into the effects like the ping pong and change the wet dry. So all these things you can do with a mouse. And so the MIDI controller is not critical to have because you can use your mouse. But the thing with a mouse is, as you've probably quickly discovered, it's hard to do two things at once with a mouse. In fact, it's pretty much impossible. With a traditional DJ mixer, you've got the advantage of your hands. And your hands, not only is there two of them, so you can do two things simultaneously, but also your hands are a lot faster at moving from knob to knob, so you can change 3 or 4 things fairly quickly, whereas with the mouse, trying to scroll around on the screen accurately and make all those changes is pretty tricky. So what the point of a MIDI controller is that it effectively ties in to your laptop, and you can set it up so all these different controls in the software in Ableton talk directly to this MIDI controller. And so when you move knobs or move faders or jog wheels on your MIDI controller, it actually moves the knobs in your Ableton software. So that's a huge, huge bonus. It gives you much more flexibility, and it's just really handy to have. Now let me talk about MIDI for a minute. MIDI is important to a producer. MIDI stands for Music Instrument Digital Interface. And, well, I won't lie. If you are trying to become a DJ, you don't really need to know what MIDI is. Now, some studio people would be appalled that I just said that. And it's true that in a studio environment, in a production environment, understanding MIDI is very, very important. But if you're just trying to DJ, you're probably not going to use MIDI for a whole lot. You have to know that it is important, but you don't have to necessarily know why it's important. Now, having said that, I'm going to give you a quick 2-minute background on what it is, just so you understand a bit more. So in the late 70s or the early 80s, I guess, people were trying to figure out a way to, they realized how musical instruments were becoming more digital, and they wanted a way for there to be a standard so all these different types of instruments could talk to each other easily. So this MIDI standard was developed, and basically what MIDI is, it's a communications protocol. And so it lets different things talk to each other, different pieces of electronic equipment. But it's also used in studios, in synthesizers and controllers and stuff like that. Basically, I guess what you could say is, if you can imagine something like 2 or 3 different instruments, like say we have a grand piano and we have a trumpet and we have a flute, and you know that on each of these 3 instruments there are notes in common. You can play a middle C, which is a C4 note, on each of those 3 different instruments. And so the fact that it's a C4, a certain pitch, is something that they all share in common. But yet the sound coming out of the 3 instruments is going to be very different because of the timbre of the instruments. So what MIDI does is MIDI strips away the audio qualities of the file. It strips away the sample, the waveform stuff, and all it does is mathematically describe what has to be played. So if you can imagine a stream of MIDI information, all it is basically it's like words describing what's happening. So within MIDI data, there's a couple different types of information that flows, like there's note data and there's control messages. So in a very simple sense, if you were using MIDI to describe the playing of those C4 notes on these different instruments, you might get a stream of information that comes from a piece of equipment that starts out with a couple control messages. It might say, okay, the tempo that we're playing, until I tell you differently, is going to be 126 beats per minute. And then it will say, it'll send an instrument message. It'll say, we are going to play, well, no, skip the instrument message. Let's go directly to notes. it might say the next note that you're going to hear is a quarter note, and it is a C note, and it is in the 4th octave. Okay? So at the other end, whatever is receiving all this information, let's say it's a synthesizer or a module or something that is designed to produce a trumpet sound. So it's receiving this information from the source, and it knows, okay, this is my tempo. It knows it's supposed to play a quarter note, and it knows the pitch, and so it plays that trumpet sound. You can do the same thing in software, and so there will be things called VSTIs, which is VST stands for Virtual Studio Technology, and so VSTs can be effects or they can be instruments commonly. Okay, so a VST is usually what they refer to as an effect. A VSTI is an instrument. So if I have MIDI data going through my program, I can drop a VSTI, a MIDI instrument, onto that data, or have the data go through that instrument, and it produces a specific sound. So if I have a VSTI of a Steinway piano, and I send MIDI through it, what comes out is notes that sound like a Steinway piano. Okay, this is not necessarily that important for DJing. What it will be important for is if you learn to start producing music. And when I get into the series about producing music, if you haven't watched that, I will talk about MIDI in much, much more detail. That's really all you have to know so far about MIDI. Now, the other thing about MIDI is that because it's a communications protocol, it's also used to let different things talk to each other. So this MIDI controller, it's funny because it doesn't actually have MIDI cords hooking it up to the computer. It uses a USB to talk to the computer. Now, different MIDI instruments, there's a certain type of cord. It's usually a 5-pin cord. And so a lot of things, like most electronic pianos, will have MIDI in and out ports. My Novation has one that you saw earlier, and I've got a Roland FP9 here. It's got MIDI in and outs. Some DJ mixers will have MIDI in and outs. My Pioneer one does not. My Allen and Heath Zone 62 does not. But my Allen and Heath Zone 4D, which we're going to use in part 4, does have MIDI interfaces. Most external USB sound cards have MIDI ports on them, okay? But having a MIDI port is not usually good for talking to a computer because most computers don't have MIDI ports. And so usually if you're trying to get MIDI data into a computer, you'll have to go through an external sound card because you'll plug in all those instruments into the sound card, and then the sound card plugs into the computer with a USB cord or a FireWire cord. So anyway, the MIDI controller does use MIDI data internally to talk to things, to talk to Ableton, but it's doing it over a USB cord. Okay, that's really all you have to know, I think, for now. Okay, so what we're going to do with this MIDI controller is we are going to hook it up to the laptop, and then we're going to teach you how to match controls within Ableton to physical controls on the MIDI controller. And that's really kind of cool stuff once you see how it's done. The MIDI controller you can have functioning independently of any of the other 4 pieces of equipment. Okay, now next, the external sound card. That is something that you can have as a standalone piece of equipment. So what's the benefit of that? Well, if you are using the laptop and you want music to go out into your speaker system, sound system, you can probably go out of the headphone port. And so what you'll do is you'll get a cord that has a 1/8 inch male at one end that plugs into your headphone port, and at the other end it's got perhaps RCA connectors or some other type of connector, and it goes into your speakers if you've got powered speakers, or it goes into your amp which feeds your speakers. Okay, so in that sense you don't really need that external sound card. But there are benefits to getting an external sound card because, number one, the quality of the headphone ports on most laptops is not that great. And so if you get an external sound card that's talking through USB to your laptop, you're probably going to get a better quality of sound coming out of it. So what you would do is have your output from Ableton or whatever music software you're using would come out of the laptop. It would get routed through the USB cord into the external sound card, and then from the external sound card it'll send an audio signal out to your speaker system. So that's one advantage of the external sound card, is better quality sound. The second advantage is that with an external sound card, if you have one that has multiple output channels, you can tell your software to play more than one piece of music or more than one audio source, more than one clip at the same time, and have the output from the different pieces of music or whatever that are playing on your laptop going through separate channels in that external sound card. And that external sound card can then feed those separate streams of audio out on a couple different cords. So let's, you know how a DJ mixer works. With a DJ mixer, you can have a single stream of audio coming into one channel. Is that useful? Well, not really. I could actually have a cord coming out of my laptop, out of the headphone port, that goes from the 1/4-inch headphone, or sorry, the 1/8-inch headphone port, and goes to an RCA pair of RCA phono plugs at the end, and then plugs into a single channel on my mixer, and then from the mixer goes to my sound system. Is there any benefit to that? No, not really. And in fact, when I'm doing this demonstration of the equipment here shortly, I'm kind of going to be talking about each piece separately and pretending that I'm not using the mixer at all, because you don't have to use the mixer. But in reality, you might be able to see it on this camera, I am feeding everything through the mixer right now. You'll have to ignore that. The only reason I'm doing that is because I'm using that line to record the audio from the laptop. So basically, yes, I am using the mixer for exactly the purpose that I just said it's not really that useful for. I've got just a normal straight feed of music going through the mixer, and then from the mixer it's going to the speakers, but I'm also using the record out to record on a separate audio device. Okay, but ignore that. So if there's not much point going directly from the laptop to the mixer, why is there a point to having the mixer? Well, if you're DJing, quite often you'll have two different sources of music. You'll have two pieces of vinyl on a turntable. You'll have two CDs on two different CD players, okay? And that lets you mix the music because you can overlap different sources of music. Well, if you get a good external sound card that allows for multiple outputs, then you can run those multiple outputs into different channels on the mixer. I'm going to take a minute now and talk about something which is a little bit confusing to some people, and that's the audio input and output routings. And this kind of relates to both audio devices such as sound cards and mixers that hook up via USB, and it also relates to MIDI devices, MIDI controllers. So let's go into options, click on preferences. Now, a couple of definitions I need to give you quickly. Number one, driver type. In order to explain drivers, I should explain latency first. Latency is a term for the delay in communications between when a signal is sent from one piece of equipment until it arrives at another piece of equipment. Latency is bad because you don't really want a delay. So what happens is you might be told that you've got a latency of 100 milliseconds, which is 1/10 of a second. A latency of 100 milliseconds between the time a key is pressed on a controller and the time the laptop receives it. Now, 100 milliseconds is kind of big in terms of audio recording time. It doesn't seem like a big deal, 1/10 of a second. Like if you press a control and it reacts on the laptop within 1/10 of a second, to a human, that's fairly fast. But to a professional audio engineer or musician, that's a fairly lengthy delay in timing, and we want to try and go for shorter latencies if there's a way to get some. So anyway, with driver types, on Windows, the MME or DirectX drivers are generally they're older types of drivers. They're kind of like the stock generic driver. It's not the best driver. If you have an option, there's another type of driver called an ASIO driver, ASIO, and generally ASIO drivers are much better. So if you have the option of going with ASIO, take the ASIO. Anyway, at the moment, I've opened up the preferences, and you can see we've got a whole bunch of different tabs here. Click on the audio tab, driver type up at the top, and you can see that I've got a whole bunch of different choices for audio output device. And what I'm going to click on now, speakers 2, high definition audio. That is the pair of speakers internal to the laptop. If you look down here, it's got an output latency of 92 milliseconds. Input latency, that's interesting. Why would speakers have an input latency? Let's look up above, and it turns out that they don't. There is a microphone selected, the laptop's internal microphone, and it has a latency of 186 milliseconds. What if we don't want to use the speakers on our laptop? What if we want to use the Zone 4D mixer that is hooked up? And right now, hooked up to the laptop, I have the Zone 4D mixer, which is also a MIDI controller. I have the Numark Mixtrack MIDI controller. I don't have my keyboard. I don't have the X Station, the Zyosynth X Station, or Novation X Station. And I do not have my Focusrite audio interface hooked up right now. So it's just the Zone 4D and the Numark MIDI controller. What if we wanted to use the Zone 4D as our output device, as our sound card? Is it there? Yes, it is. So I could select that for the speakers to go out. And I could also say that input from the Zone D coming into the laptop is possible. So let's click on that. Okay, so with these two items, with our MME or DirectX drivers, we're still looking at huge latencies, 186 and 92 milliseconds. Let's see if there's an ASIO driver. Click on that, and driver type ASIO, audio device, Zone 4D USB ASIO driver. That's good. Okay, and then when we look down at our latency, that's a huge difference. It went from 186 milliseconds to just under 7 milliseconds. That's a pretty decent, that's a very low number. And then the output latency has also dropped quite a bit. So, good example that ASIO drivers are good. So I'm just going to leave that up right now. I will point out that you can go into input and output configurations. Now, on the Zone 4D, there are quite a few different outputs available. There's 10, basically 5 stereo pairs. And so you can see that all these are available. If we're not using some of them, because we're only going out to two channels, to a split stereo channel, then we don't have to turn on all the other outputs. But if we were going to be sending signals to a whole bunch of different channels at once, we'd want to turn those on. Okay, I won't do that for now. If we had gone back into our speakers, the laptop speakers, and look at the output configuration, how many do you think are going to be there? 10 again? No, 2, because all there is 2 speakers in the laptop. So that's just a single master audio channel goes to the speakers within the laptop. Alright, so basically that's how you set your audio preferences. You make sure your devices are plugged in, and then try to find the best driver first, and then make sure the audio device you want to use is the one that you've selected in the drop-down list. And if you need to test it, there's a test tone you can turn on and off. And something you should be aware of is a lot of devices, if the laptop's already powered up and Ableton is already running, and then you go plug the USB device into the laptop, it often will not show up in your drop-down menu. If that's the case, you probably have to power down Ableton, then maybe even power down the laptop, then plug in your USB cord so the device is connected, and then reboot, possibly reboot the laptop, definitely reboot Ableton. And so if you do that, then quite often all of a sudden your missing device will show up in your drop-down menu. I don't know if there's another way to actually make it discover a device that you've plugged in while Ableton's running. It would concern me if I was playing a set out live and the USB cord became unattached, because when you plug it back in, does that mean that Ableton can't see it? That's a good question. I will have to investigate this before I play out again. Okay, and then the other thing that I wanted to look at quickly was MIDI. And so you can see my new mark is here, and it's also here. It's listed as both an input and an output device. And the reason for that is because it talks to the laptop in both directions. It sends signals to the laptop, but it will also receive some information from the laptop. So as an input device, your laptop is listening to input from that numeric. Now, the Zone 4D, same deal. It's a MIDI controller, a MIDI controller as well as being a audio device, as well as being a sound card. And so you can also talk to the MIDI controller. Now, you'll see different settings here: track, sync, and remote. And which ones do you turn on? That's a good question. If you're uncertain, usually it doesn't hurt to turn them all on. So if you don't know what to do, safest approach, turn them all on. Usually that doesn't screw anything up. But what are they really for? Well, they are for they're to tell the laptop what needs to be communicated and listened to. Basically, with track, if a device is going to be sending note data, then you should have track turned on. So if I had my keyboard hooked up and I'm possibly going to be playing notes on it to send into Ableton, definitely you want to have track turned on. Other data, other than note data, may not matter. I usually turn on track no matter what to be safe. Now, what does sync do? Sync deals with clocks, because if two devices are talking to each other, they may want to be synchronized to each other, in which case one will act as a master and one will act as a slave. And you can set which one you want to be the master and which one to be the slave. But basically the master one, the clock signals from that are going to go to the other devices that it's talking to, and they will all listen for that clock instead of running their own clock. Because if everyone's running their own clock and the clocks are off by a tiny bit, everything goes crazy. So usually there's only a single master device in a group of MIDI devices. Now, for sync, because our controllers we're not really dealing with clock data sort of stuff. We're not dealing with performances. We're just sending messages by flipping levers. So sync generally doesn't matter with MIDI controllers that we are using in a DJ set, generally. Final option, remote. That means that the device, when it sends control signals, i.e. when you're moving knobs, moving faders, whatnot, that means that Ableton is listening. So remote, very important, must be turned on. Okay, so right now I have all three turned on with the numeric. I do not have remote turned on with the zone MIDI, but I'm going to turn it on because I might be trying to get some information. And is there any chance I'll be sending MIDI data out to the zone? Probably not, but I'm turning that on anyway. If you look up in this corner, the top right little button there, when I press something, press on any of my MIDI devices, press, you'll see that it flashes, and that means that Ableton is receiving MIDI data. The one underneath it flashes when it's sending MIDI data, like say you're playing a MIDI clip that's going to an external synthesizer. Okay, so you'll get a brief flash if you press a button. If I try and spin the jog wheel, it's constantly sending data, so it kind of stays lit until I let go. Anyway, that's basically how your MIDI works in a very simplified manner. Again, if your device isn't showing up, try rebooting Ableton. If it still isn't showing up, try rebooting your computer. Always plug peripherals into your computer, and if they have a power switch of their own, power them up before you start your laptop. That's the general order of booting devices. Peripherals first, then to the core. Also, you should be aware that some MIDI controllers actually need a power source of their own. Some do not. For instance, this Numark mixer, or sorry, the Numark mix track MIDI controller, it is small enough and has a low enough power draw that it's actually getting its power from the USB cord. So the laptop is basically acting as the power supply through the USB cord for that controller. For something bigger, needing more power, more of a draw, like my keyboard, my Novation X-Station keyboard, that will get some power from the USB, but it also takes a external power supply plugged in. So make sure that your external peripherals are powered up before you boot up the laptop. So that's your whole sequence. Power up peripherals, plug them in, power up the laptop, then load Ableton. And if you do it in that order, everything should show up in your preferences here, and you shouldn't run into any problems. One last thing here in the preferences, you'll see some control surfaces. If you click on one of those, there's a drop-down list. There are certain control surfaces which have been pre-configured because these are really popular things, and they're pre-configured so that they have this generic instant mapping built into Ableton. So for instance, an APC40 from Akai, if I had one of those plugged in, and well, I probably wouldn't have to select it because Ableton would probably recognize it's there and bring it up. But if that was the case, a lot of the controls on the APC40 kind of default to certain things within Ableton. So you don't necessarily have to go through and do as much MIDI mapping as you would if you were dealing with a generic control surface that is not popular, that's not in that drop-down list. Okay, so that's why some control surfaces are in this list, but if yours is not, then you can just treat it as a generic MIDI controller and turn on track, turn on remote, and you should be good to go. Okay, I'm going to take a minute right now to apologize in advance for the complexity of the rest of this video. We're about to get into routing stuff, and the reason is because I want to be able to teach you a little bit about queuing from within Ableton. Now this stuff, if you find it hard to understand, don't be surprised. A lot of people do. And in fact, I often find it quite hard to even explain. So there's a little bit of complexity here, a little bit of confusion and frustration. Just bear with it. Now, what I'm going to try and explain here, also be aware that sometimes there's more than one way to do it, more than one different type of routing to make things work the way that you're hoping. And so I'm not always going to show you every way, and I'm not even necessarily going to show you the best way. So, but I will show you enough, I hope, to get you, give you a basic understanding of some of the stuff that I'm doing, and to get you thinking, because that's the most important part. And I mean, not every DJ is going to need to know all this stuff, because if you're going with a really simple setup, you probably aren't even queuing at all, in which case this next section is mostly irrelevant, although you should watch it to try and start learning it. Also, if you happen to be lucky enough to have access to better equipment, like perhaps you've got a system where you can actually send several channels out simultaneously to a real DJ mixer, if that's the case, then you're probably going to want to do all your queuing on the physical mixer instead of within Ableton. And if that's the case, then all you need to understand is the basic routing of the different channels to your mixer. Okay, and I mean, last but not least, also I should mention maybe that this is the most confusing part of the 4 parts of this series. So bear with it, and at least once you get through this stuff, even if it takes a couple times watching it to really make it sink in, at least the 4th part of the series is going to be easier to understand than the rest of this video. Okay, good luck. Let's give it a shot. So looking at Ableton right now, see how we have these options in our input-output routings? We have audio to external out, audio to external out. So that means it's going to our external sound card. You know, we have different choices, but we'll leave it on external out. And let's assume that we have a sound card that has multiple outputs. Okay, so we could have the left channel going to 1 and 2, and we could have the right channel going to 3 and 4. And by 1 and 2, it means the left and right. So 1 and 2 are kind of a pair, which creates a stereo output. Okay, so in this example, my left channel music is going to 1 and 2, my right channel is going to 3 and 4, and what I can do is take my 1 and 2 outputs from my sound card and run a chord that goes into, say, this channel on the mixer, and then I can have my 3 and 4 outputs on the sound card going through another chord, perhaps going into this channel. And so then I've got the ability, because I've got music going through each channel, I have the ability to use this like a normal DJ mixer, like I would in any circumstance. And the only difference is that my 2 different sources of music, instead of being 2 CD players or 2 turntables, are 2 different streams of music coming out of Ableton. Okay, and then I'd have my ability to use my EQ knobs on the mixer. I'd have my ability to use my effects like the echo, the flanger, all that sort of stuff. So if I am able to do that, because I've got a good sound card that has more than 2 outputs, it has 2 pairs of outputs at least, then essentially I can use a real DJ mixer, and I can ignore having to use a bunch of the effects like the EQ3s and so on within Ableton. So it gives me more flexibility that I can do the stuff on the mixer instead of within Ableton. So having said that, I guess you see the point of each of these 4 pieces of equipment: the headphones, MIDI controller, USB card, and mixer. So let me take a diversion here for a second and cover a few things that I should have covered in part 2 and omitted. When we did the screen tour, let's see, one thing that I did not show you is, if you see the height right now of these controls, see how if you put your mouse on that line, it becomes an up-down arrow? You can click, hold, and move up and make your fader a lot taller. Now, if you have it compressed too much, you lose some information, which isn't there normally at the start. But if you go up a little bit, you all of a sudden start seeing some stuff that's useful. You start seeing the numbers, the scale in decimals on the right side of the fader, and you see these things. So when I was talking earlier about how sometimes it's nice to bring the level down a little bit below the standard level, well, if you've got the fader up there, you can also manually punch that in. Okay, so that's one benefit. Now, other controls here that are found on each channel. This is your pan knob, your so you can pan to the left, pan to the right, and of course you can do that on each channel. This is your channel on-off button. It's kind of like the input selector switch at the top of a mixer. So if I have something playing and I turn it off, then it's not going to go through to your master. Okay. Another thing that you can do is, let's say we start a scene, and so we've got stuff going in two different channels. This button is a solo button, so if I click it, only this channel will be playing, or only that channel will be playing. Now, it's not actually playing at the moment because I have it routed to 3 and 4, which don't exist. Okay, so let's move that routing back to 1 and 2. Let's try that again. Okay, so we have two different tracks playing. I can solo that one, or I can solo this one. Or, if I hold down Control, I can solo more than one button. Okay, so that's kind of useful. What else? I do like to have this line up a little tiny bit so you can kind of see what your things are there, if possible. There's this little wavy line that's not really important for us DJing, but in case you wonder, that opens up the groove editor. Not really important for us though. Let's see. Time elapsed and time remaining. Oh, there's another thing. If you press play, see this bar right here? There's nothing happening in it, but if you press play, it turns to a different color, and basically as the song plays, it's going to start showing a progress indicator of how much has been played, and it also has a time display there which does a countdown of how much time is remaining in the track. So once you get near the end of the track, let's say, well, let's move the cursor to the middle. Okay, so you can see the progress bar now says we're halfway through. 18 seconds left, 17, 16 left in the song, and then it's going to end. Okay, so that's useful. Now, we're still working with the project that we started to create in part 2. I have I have saved it. I just called it YouTube Performing Live Set. So always good to save your work frequently. Now on this on this setup, let's oh, and one more thing I meant to talk about. This is something that's confused a few people in my other video about putting together DJ mix using Ableton. They ask how you can mix together tracks that are of different speeds. You have to understand that warping, once a track is warped, it is going to follow the global tempo. This is the global tempo. Right now I have it set at 130. Now, if you click on any particular track, you can see that it's got all these properties down here in this window, and you can see what the original segment BPM was supposed to be. This is Ableton's guess, but Ableton thinks it's about 125.99 beats per minute, the original song. So my guess is that whoever produced this actually recorded it at 126 BPM, and Ableton is just a little bit confused, so it's not quite perfect. Okay, so you can go through and click on each thing. You can see this one was 129 BPM. The original of this one is a little over 124. This one's 126, 126, 126, 124, 127, 128, 127, 124. Okay, so they're all different speeds, but because I have warp markers on them all, when I press play on any one of these, it is not going to play at its original speed. It's going to play at the global tempo of 130. And I can change that. as the music is playing, I can actually use the mouse. I can speed it up a whole lot. I can slow it down. And then I can bring it back to whatever speed I want my DJ set to be. Okay? And while I'm doing all that speeding up and down, the track is warped, and so it is going to follow whatever tempo I keep changing. If you wanted to play this song at its original speed of 125.99 BPMs or whatever, all you have to do is take warp off, and when I press play on it, it will play at its original tempo rather than at the global tempo. But that's not much use to us in a DJ set, because we're probably trying to do beat mixing. Alright, so let's talk about the fun thing. Let's talk about setting up our MIDI controller to control all these different things on our DJ set, our effects and whatnot. Okay, we are going to... Okay, we are in our left DJ channel. We have our EQ3, and we have low, mid, and high gains on a scale, on a rotary knob, on a pot knob, panning potentiometer. We also have on-off buttons for each of those three, so instead of rolling it down slowly with the mouse, you can just turn it off instantly. It would be kind of handy if we could put those on our MIDI controller. So let's see how to do that. If you move up to the right corner here, there's a button that says MIDI. If you click it, a whole lot of stuff is going to turn blue on the screen. Okay? Click it again, it goes back to normal. You don't actually have to click on that button. You can hold down Control and hit M. And what happens now is we've entered mapping mode. And so anything right now that is shaded this bluish purple, that is something that you can change with the mouse normally. But when we're in mapping mode, what's going to happen if you click on any of these things, then Ableton starts listening for your MIDI device to send a control signal. And as soon as it does, it's going to map that control signal to that control, which means it's going to tie the two of them together. So let's say that I want to, on this MIDI controller, I have three buttons here, which are intended to be bass, mid, and treble. Well, that's perfect, because those fit well with what I'm trying to do. So let's click on the low, and you're going to see these little brackets show up in the corners around it. Okay, that means it's listening for a control signal. And this is my left channel bass knob, so if I do anything to it, you'll see that a control has been assigned. Okay, up here in this MIDI mappings box, item number CC20, control number 20, which is this thing on this piece of equipment, now is tied in to the low gain of the EQ unit, EQ3 unit, on the left DJ channel. Okay, let's click another one. Let's assign the mid. All you have to do is give it a quick tweak, and then the high. Okay, now let's say that I also use these three buttons frequently. Let's pick some random buttons on the MIDI controller. Now, they don't say that these are low, mid, and high cutoffs for the EQ3. They actually say in, out, and re-loop. And that's because this controller is designed to normally be used with a specific piece of software. But it is also a generic MIDI controller, so you can ignore the standard things that it's been designed for and realize that those are just generic MIDI buttons. So let's put the in to match loop. So we click on that, and then we hit the button. And then for the mid on off, we'll hit this button. And for gain high, we'll hit this button. Alright, Now, so basically these three controls and these three buttons will match the controls on the EQ3 on our left DJ channel. Let's highlight the right column, and we want to do the same thing with the controls on the right side of the controller. So we will go low, tweak, mid, tweak, high, tweak, low, hit the button, medium, hit the button, high, hit the button. Okay, what else can we automate? I think it would be nice to now you can see when I clicked on the right DJ channel so I could show you the EQ3, it is one of the things that's highlighted purplish blue. And so what happened was I touched something, because you can see it's now got 124 assigned to it. I don't even know what control that is on here, but I've accidentally assigned something to it. I can right click on that and go delete mapping, okay? Because I don't know what that is, and I don't want to hit something on this and accidentally make it do something to the right channel. But what is there on this that I could still automate that would be useful? Well, what about the volumes? Okay, left channel volume, we'll click on that and we will move the left slider. And right channel volume, we'll move the right slider. And let's go over to this master volume and put it on the middle slider. Okay, we've got a lot of stuff automated now. Is there anything else we want to do? Well, let's show our send returns and ping pong channel. Let's put the let's do this. Let's delete. Okay, I can't delete because I'm in mapping mode. So let's click on this, get out of mapping mode. I'm going to delete the ping pong send return. Okay, and I'm going to put a ping pong on each of my two tracks, even though I said earlier that is expensive because I'm either buying two physical pieces or in software it's adding processing power because I'm using multiple instances. But let's do this. Let's put let's go back into mapping mode, and I'm on the right channel right now because it's highlighted, and let's put our dry wet control on this thing. And then let's go into the left channel and let's put our dry wet of the ping pong on this thing. And then let's go out of MIDI mapping mode because I've mapped a lot of stuff already, and that should be more than enough. Okay, so looking at our controller, we have volume controls, in theory, on our two channels. We have EQ stuff, we have more EQ stuff, and we have the wet dries for the two ping pong effects. First thing that you should do once you've finished mapping is move or hit each knob from its lowest to highest value to make sure they are all registering. Okay? Now, the reason I did that is because sometimes when you first go to use it, it doesn't recognize it. I can't really explain this. Sometimes it doesn't recognize it unless it goes past a certain value, and so going from one side to the other, the two extremes of the range, lets you make sure that you've gone past that certain value. Because otherwise, sometimes, like say the bass doesn't register until it's almost all the way up at the top, and say that after you've assigned the value, it happens to be near the bottom, and when you're playing, you're just using the bottom range, maybe it's not going to do anything for a while because you never actually get it up to the top part of the range to kind of make it start working. Just go with it for now. You'll practice this and you'll understand. Okay, so looking at my EQ3 on my left channel, if I move these knobs, you can see how it's actually moving the controls on the screen. So this is really quite cool. Now, my gain high knob is not doing anything. Let's go back into mapping mode and see what happened. Click on it again, move it again. Oh, see, the wrong control got assigned to that somehow. I don't know how. It happens frequently. I must have hit something. Maybe the jog wheel is that 124. Maybe when I went to go and move the control, I actually bumped the jog wheel, and so it thought I was trying to assign the jog wheel to the control. Anyway, does it work? Yes, it works now. And on the right thing, looks like they're all working. Ping pong, yes, working. Okay, let's do a quick DJ set and see what happens. Now, before I go any further, you can see a problem. You can see that I've got a red signal. It's peaking, it's too strong. Why is that? It's because these things, when I have them up at full strength, see how they're all going up to 6 decibels? Normally that's the 0 is the top level on all these controls, but it gives you some headroom. And the problem is, when I've got them at their full strength, instead of being at 0 decibels, which is kind of the perfect top level, it's going up into that peak area. I don't like that. So I wonder if there's a way to change that. Well, there is. Go back into MIDI mode, MIDI mapping mode, and over here on this side of the mapping box, you have minimum and maximum values. Let's set these so that instead of 6 decibels being the maximum possible value when the knob is all the way over to the right, let's change them all to 0. Okay, now I cannot exceed 0 decibels on any of these things. Okay, and see how they're still set at 6? This is another example of what I said, how it doesn't really reset until you move it. I'm going to move the gain mid there. When I turn it back up, it won't go past 0. Okay, and the same thing's going to happen to all of these. Okay, now with my slider, I also set it so when it's at its maximum value, it only goes to 0 instead of up to 6. If I want to change it so I've got a little bit of headroom, let's see where those things are. Track volume for left DJ channel, right and master. So let's change those all to -3. Well, we'll just change the 2 channel sliders, not master. Okay, so when I put those at their highest value, they only go to -3. That's kind of handy. All right. Now, what's happening? Are these actually going to the master? It doesn't look like it. Why? Because I have this slider down. Now I can still move it with my mouse, but I've got it assigned to this. There, that's better. Now, the next thing, you can see that I've got my audio routed directly to the external sound card, which I have plugged in already. I probably shouldn't have done that. Normally, it should be going to the master. Okay? Then from the master, it would go out to the external sound card. So there's a difference in the routing. Instead of going directly out of these channels out to the physical equipment, we want it to go through the master channel first and then out to the equipment. And then that means that when we've got stuff playing, our master volume works like the master volume on a DJ mixer. Okay? So you can see how handy this MIDI controller is already, because now instead of playing with instead of being able to do stuff only at a certain speed with the mouse, I can do stuff fairly quickly by using multiple hands. Okay, you get the point. Simple. Very simple. Okay, so that's how a MIDI controller works. I don't think I need to explain any more. Okay, let's move on to the sound card. So with this particular sound card that we have, this Focusrite 18i6, I'm going to be mean and say I don't like it. This is not a good sound card for DJing. It's a decent quality sound card in a lot of respects, but I think this one is designed more for a home recording environment. It's got more focus on inputs, so if you were, say, a studio engineer and you were recording a band, it's great to have all these inputs to get all these instruments in, but for DJ, where we're trying to get signals out, not so useful. However, the interesting thing is that there is another model similar to this, called the Scarlett 8i6, and the 8i6, even though it's a cheaper model and it looks less comprehensive, has less inputs, I think it might be a little bit more suited to DJing, because even though it still says 6, as in 6 outputs, it's actually built a little bit differently, and it's got 4 outputs on the back, 4 mono outputs, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that gives us what I was talking about earlier, the ability to send 2 stereo signals out to 2 different channels of a mixer. So if I can get my hands on one of those, I would like to investigate that. But for now, let's talk about this in a theoretical sense. Now, this sound card does have a pair of outputs on the back, outputs 1 and 2, and in theory, it has a headphone jack on the front, which is supposed to be 3 and 4 is the channel numbers. Now, if we go into our routings, audio 2, this should theoretically give us a way to do queuing. Do you understand how? If I go external out for each of these, and let's say that the Figuero song is playing quietly, and let's say that I want to hear Spartak in my headphones. Well, if my headphones are plugged in and they say that it's channel 3/4, then I should be able to change this to 3/4, play this, press play, and it should go into my headphones only. And because it's not going to 1 and 2, which are the channels that are hooked up to my sound system, I should have this channel going to the dance floor and this one going to my headphones. Now, unfortunately, that's not what's happened in practice. And to be honest, I'm not sure why. I did some digging on the internet, and I found some reviews that say that for some reason the Scarlett series has the front headphone port has a copy of the audio that's going out the back outputs. That's very odd in my mind. Perhaps I'm reading it wrong, but that will not do. Okay. So, but let's do a setup here and talk about how we could do queuing if it actually worked the way I think it's supposed to. Now, other external audio sound cards are not necessarily the same way. I've used other cards where I do a setup like this and it works the way it's intended. So I don't think I'm making a mistake here, although it's possible. Alright, so let's figure out how would we do queuing the same that we would do on a DJ mixer. So let's pretend that we have access to the sound card, but we don't have access to a DJ mixer. And yet we want to be able to do queuing because, as you know, queuing is useful for the DJ to hear what's going on without the dance floor necessarily hearing it. Okay? Under the system that I just described, are there weaknesses? Well, yes. Because if you change the routing on this to go to 3/4, so you can hear it in the headphones, assuming it worked, the drawback is that because it's going to 3/4, the dance floor doesn't hear it any longer. You don't want a system where your only options are either the dance floor or the headphones. That doesn't give you the flexibility you want. You want the option to be able to turn on and off the dance floor and on and off the headphones independently of each other. So you could have neither playing, both playing, just the dance floor, or just the headphones. You could have the music going into any one of those 4 possibilities. So how can we do that? Well, again, this is going to be a theoretical layout, but let me try and show you a trick. Let's create another channel. Let's stop that first. We'll create another channel by right-clicking, insert audio track, and so now we have this channel in the middle. I'm going to make it a little bit thinner so it doesn't take up as much space, and I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call it Q channel. Okay. What I'm going to do is have it set up so that my external out on the Q channel goes to 3 and 4. I'm going to put this one back to 1 and 2. Okay, so if I have stuff playing in my left channel, it's going to be routed to 1 and 2, which is my dance floor. If I have stuff playing in the right DJ channel, it has stuff going to 1 and 2, which again goes out to the dance floor. So that's good. We can also set it this way. We can go audio is going to master. That's a better setup. And what happens is our audio from either of these channels goes to the master, and then from the master it goes out to 1 and 2 on the dance floor. Okay, now Ableton does have queuing built into it in theory. See how this button says solo? because my cue output on the master channel is set to the same as the master output, it only says solo. And clicking any one of these buttons turns on the solo option, like I said earlier. Holding Control and clicking a couple of these options lets you put multiple on at the same time. But if you've got a sound card that gives you multiple output channels, like this one thinks it does, and you set it to a different channel, see, now my cue is going to 3/4. If I hit this solo button, I can switch it and it becomes a cue button. That is handy, or it should be. In this case, I should be able to click any of these buttons. Let's say something's playing. See how it's green signal because it's going out to the dance floor? If I click cue, it turns to a blue color. And in theory, that signal should be going to my headphones right now. It's not, but whatever. Try that with your own sound cards. If you've got a sound card with multiple outputs, that should work to give you cueing in your headphones, if your sound card works properly. Now, let's say that I want to hear something in my headphones, I'm cueing it, but I'm just flipping through a couple songs. I don't want the dance floor to hear it. How do I do that? I turn off the feed to the dance floor, and you can hear it's not going to the master. It's not going to the dance floor. Yet, if I click it, it turns blue, and it should be going to your headphones. And that way, that gives you the ability to cue something without the dance floor hearing it simultaneously. Okay? Now, is there a drawback to doing this, to flipping on and off cueing in the channel? No, you can totally do that. But I have found that sometimes I will make a mistake and hit the wrong button, and I'll have that off and think I'm cueing and I'm the only person hearing it, and I'll accidentally hit that perhaps, and boom, this song accidentally goes out to the dance floor. Okay, so this is why I have created this magical cue channel. And, well, this is part of the reason why. It's to prevent me from making my own mistakes. Okay. By the way, I've turned these all off so they say there is no input. There's no audio coming into Ableton. That would be something we'd use in like a studio recording environment. If we were playing a piano or something and we needed to import audio, then you could do routings there. But that's not relevant right now, so you can turn those off to make it simple. Anyway, okay, so I've got this cue channel. Let's see what happens. Remember how we can move stuff back and forth? Well, let's say we've got something playing here, and we move it over to here. It's still playing. Now, the output routing for this says it's going to 3/4, which is our headphones. If I play this, and I have that turned off so it's not going to my master channel, I can set this up basically by leaving the 2 turned off constantly for the whole set, and leaving the headphone icon turned on, blue for the whole set. Then this channel essentially becomes a permanent cue channel. So I can bring something over here, press play, and listen to it, and hear it in my headphones, and it's not going out to the dance floor. Ultimately, this is not really any different than playing with the buttons in either of the channels, but it's a little bit safer. You're less likely to make a mistake. However, there is a certain benefit. Now, let's say that I want to hear both what I'm cueing and what's going out to the dance floor at the same time. Okay, so I've got this cue playing, and let's say that this redhead track is already going out to the dance floor. I can hold down my control key and I can click on my cue button here, and now both of these are coming into my headphones. So basically I'm now hearing my cueing of my track that the dance floor can't hear, and I'm also hearing the master output. That's good. Okay, we're starting to get a little bit more power here, a little more flexibility. If you remember from my mixer video, on the Pioneer mixer, I can set this so that this button over here switches back and forth between cue and master in my headphones. So I have the ability in my headphones to hear either the cueing of the track that I want to listen to, or what the dance floor is hearing, or a mix of the two. Can we do the same thing here? Yes, we just did it. Now the only drawback is the way we just did it. Remember how I said in my mixer video, I prefer to do cueing so that the track that I'm cueing, the new one, is always in my left ear, and my right ear hears the monitor, hears the dance floor. And it can either be because I'm listening to a booth monitor, or because I've actually got it split. So in my headphones, left ear is cue, right ear is dance floor, is master. Okay, that's a nice system. It's an arbitrary system. You might want to learn backwards. You might want to have it so your right ear is your cue and left ear is the dance floor. That's cool. Just pick something and be consistent. But for me, being able to split it so one thing is on, cue is on one side and master's on the other, I find to be more useful than what I just described here, because of the fact that here you've got a stereo signal for each item. So they're kind of blending in both ears. Is there a way around this? Yes. With these pan knobs, obviously the first thing that I want to do is to switch my cue channel so it's totally on the left side. Okay, so I've kind of already half solved the problem, because now my cueing is only in my left ear anyway. If I punch the cue button in on either track which is playing out to the master, I'm still going to get the master in both ears, which is workable. It's better than master and cue both being in both ears. But can we take it a step further? Can we get it so that the left and right channels, the master, only ends up in one side of the headphones? Well, we can't do it this way, because if we switched our panning on either channel or on the master so that it goes just to the right side, the problem is the dance floor is only going to hear the right side of the speakers, of the sound. So is there another way? Yes, there is. This is kind of cool. Let's set up a send return track to help us out. Okay, we're getting a little more complicated here, I know, but right click, insert return track. Okay, let's rename this. Let's call this cueing, cue master. Okay, now let's imagine what happens if we show the sends. So cue master is C, which is this control. If I play something here, we got all sorts of stuff playing. Let's say I play one song here in my left channel. You can see that there's nothing going to the cue master. You can click on it. We didn't put any audio effects here. Remember when we used the send returns for these two things, it's because we wanted the sound not only to go there, but we also wanted it to be changed by an effect. Send return. Think of those words. You send it to this track where it gets processed, and then it returns. Now what if instead of doing a send return, we do a send only? We don't change our signal. We don't need to put any effects on it. We just want to hear something. We want to hear the original. And instead of the output of this send return coming back to the master, what if we change it so that it goes to our cue, to our headphones. Okay? So if I raise this, watch what happens to the volume here in my C send return, the cue master. Okay? I start getting a copy of the audio from my left channel, or from my right channel if I use that one, and if I actually have something playing. Okay, so that's going to this thing that I call cue master. Now, the cue master is going out to channel 3 and 4, which is the headphones. So essentially, what's happening is I've shown you two completely different methods for cueing. You can either use the cue buttons in Ableton, which is the obvious, easy way, makes sense. But you can also, through routing, send your signal using a send out of either thing into the cueing channel, and then the cueing goes to your headphones. Okay, I could also, instead of sending it out to the headphones that way, I guess I could also turn the cueing on this way. But why did I bother setting up a send return instead of going the simple way here? Well, it comes back to our goal of trying to have cue in one side and master in the other. Because what happens if we send the master signal? Now, technically this is not the master per se. This is something that's playing. So if we've got a song playing in left channel, it goes through the master out to the dance floor. That's really what we want to hear. We want to hear what's going to the dance floor. So we're not actually monitoring, we're not listening to the master, we're kind of taking a shortcut, listening to the original source. But if we press play on something in here, and we then send it to the master, come on, sorry, we use the send return and send it to this cue channel, that is basically the same thing as if we were listening to the master right now. Now, what if we change the panning on that cue master to be in the right ear? Okay. So now, if I have something going in my cue channel, what's happening is that I have two things coming into my headphones simultaneously. I have this track that I'm cueing, which is coming in my left channel, and you can see it's coming in the left channel because that's the only one that's flashing. I also have the track that's going out to the dance floor. It's going out to the dance floor, but in addition, this send is putting it into this cue channel, and so my right ear of my headphones has a copy of what's going to the dance floor. Okay? That's a little bit complicated, obviously, if you haven't played with sends and returns a lot, but if you kind of follow through, do this step by step and play with it, you'll see how this kind of a setup can give you far more flexibility. Now, in a traditional DJ setup, a mixer and playing vinyl or CDs, you really have to be on top of your cueing, because you use your cueing to make sure that your beat mixing is going properly. So it's very, very critical. In Ableton, when your tracks are already warped, cueing is not such a big deal. It's not as important as it is for live DJ. So it may be that you decide, delete, I don't want to use that, because the only time you're ever cueing is you're just trying to pick which song to go next. Okay, so maybe I'm trying to figure out, maybe Figuera is playing, and I'm trying to decide, I know I want to play a J Lumen track next, so I'll play that one for a minute, figure out, yeah, okay, I know what song that is. See, that's the problem. never drag a playing song back into a track that's going out to your dance floor. Okay, and then I try out the second J Lumen track, listen to a little bit of it, realize, oh yeah, I remember that. I stop it before I bring it back into my active track. And then now I know which one I'm going to play. Okay, so cueing is still useful in Ableton to figure out what you're going to play next. Not as critical as a live setup. Okay, let's stop. That's enough of that kind of routing thing. So that's why, coming back, the whole point of this was to explain why a good external sound card with multiple routings is useful, because you can start doing cueing the same as you would with a live DJ mixer. Now, is there another way to do this? Yes. Remember how I said in one of the earlier sections of this video that most of the stuff that you can do on equipment, Ableton is able to do it on the screen. But sometimes Ableton, because you're limited to using a mouse and you're limited to using a software interface, sometimes doing this stuff in Ableton is not the easiest way. Well, what's a better way to do cueing? The ideal way would be to do it on a mixer like you're used to if you have already been a DJ. So I've just made a few minor changes to my set here. I've eliminated my cue channel because we're going to assume that we now have access to a DJ mixer and we don't need to do our cueing within Ableton anymore. I also eliminated the send return that I set up for cueing, and I am going to take my current sound card. Remember how I said it's got two outputs, two mono outputs, which would be great for sending out one channel of stereo sound? Well, let's say that for the sake of education here, let's split it up so that the mono outputs 1 and 2 from my sound card are going into two separate channels on my mixer. Okay? So I'm going to plug it in, and remember how I said I had both lines going into a channel earlier because I was recording on that external audio device? Okay, well, I'm going to unplug one, I'm going to unplug the white one here, and I'm plugging it into a different channel. So now I have the output number 1 going into my left channel on my mixer. So let's configure that. External out has to go to a mono instead of a stereo. It has to go to number 1. And that is physically connected to this channel on the mixer. And then my right channel, the red one, is still where it was before. And that we also have to go to a mono, and we're going to number 2 because that's plugged into channel 2 on the back of my sound card. So if I play two songs simultaneously, I should have a mono signal going into half of this channel from my left DJ channel here, and I should have a mono signal coming from this one into my right. Okay, so right now I have my mixer set up so it is functioning like a traditional DJ mixer. So I can do my cueing on the mixer, I can play with my EQ on the mixer, I can do everything on the mixer like I would as a normal DJ. Ultimately, we're starting to get a lot closer to a setup that a traditional DJ is comfortable with. And that's good, because you can DJ with just Ableton, as we showed you in the last part, in part 2. But as you start getting more and more peripherals, more pieces of equipment that you have access to, then you can make it more and more like a traditional DJ setup, which is good because you enjoy the strengths and flexibility of traditional DJing, and instead of Ableton kind of being everything that's happening, Ableton is more focusing on keeping the warping keeping the beat mixing straightforward and lets you do a little bit more hands-on performance on physical equipment, which I think is a good thing. Okay, so at this point, I don't know actually what else I should show you in this section. I think we'll call it a wrap for this particular segment. You understand how you can do mapping from our MIDI controller to the different controls in Ableton, and you understand how the external sound card can be useful because you can route your audio through it to get a higher quality signal. If you've got multiple outputs, you can send them to different channels on a mixer, so you can DJ in a traditional style. And if it's got a proper separate channel for headphones, you can also do limited queuing through that headphone port. Once you get to the mixer, if you've got multiple channels of audio coming into your mixer, you're able to perform just like a traditional DJ. So one final thing that I should mention too, you're probably thinking, well, if we can go to the point where we can get sound into multiple channels on a DJ mixer at the same time, and so we can do all our EQing and stuff on that, then do we really need the MIDI controller? Or should we just stop using it because we'll do our EQing on the mixer? Well, that's kind of true in a sense. But remember, the MIDI controller can be used to control anything in Ableton. Okay, so what happens if we've got a DJ mixer that doesn't have any effects, or it only has some effects, and there's some effects in Ableton that you like that you want to be able to use too? So you can actually use both the MIDI controller and the mixer in parallel. What I might do is I might take the EQs, the EQ3s, off of my two channels, because I don't really need to use EQing within Ableton anymore because I've got them on the master. But what I might do is bring in some more effects from all this this group of effects on the left-hand side of the screen. I might bring in, say, 3 or 4 different effects onto each of the two channels, and then for my MIDI controller, instead of having it mapped to things like EQ controls, which are redundant now because of our DJ mixer, I'll map controls from my MIDI controller to these different new effects, which are not available on my DJ mixer. And so basically I'll have 2 surfaces that I'll be playing with as I'm DJing, which gives me more flexibility. I've got my traditional mixer controls, and I've got my MIDI controls playing with stuff in Ableton that no vinyl DJ would have access to. Okay, so I think you're starting to see the power of all this equipment combined with Ableton. I could do another quick 5-minute performance, but I don't think that's necessary at this point. Let's just call it a wrap for this section, and in the next section we're going to move into the most fun. We're going to move into a mixer which combines the attributes of 3 of these things into one. It combines the sound card, the DJ mixer, and the MIDI controller, and that's where you're truly going to see the power of Ableton.